Let us now talk about the aperture. The aperture is another very important thing inside the camera which controls the light and how much light can enter into the camera sensor. Earlier we said that a camera is a dark box with a sensor inside it. And to allow the light to enter into this dark box, we open a hole in this box. When we explained that, we only said that we open a hole and we put in front of this hole a shutter to control the amount of light entering. But we did not talk about the size of this hole. The size is the aperture. In other words, you can control the size of this hole through which light will enter to your sensor. Now this is straightforward. If you are in a dark environment, you will set the hole to a big size to allow the maximum possible amount of light to enter inside your sensor. While if you are shooting in a bright area, you will decrease the size of this hole, the aperture, to minimize the quantity of light entering into the camera. So, bright environment, small hole size. Dark environment, big hole size. So now you have two things that can control the light entering into your camera: the shutter speed and the size of the aperture. Another important thing that we have to note is that the size of the aperture is controlled from the lens and not from the camera. In fact, the hole that we create on the camera is fixed in size. The lens is the thing that has the ability to open and closes the hole size and not the camera itself. This means when you are going to buy a lens, you should read on the lens what is the maximum aperture size and what is the minimum aperture size. Depending on the sizes that the lens can open and close the shutter, it will change its price. The aperture is measured in f-stops. When the number of the aperture is small, it means that the hole is big. And when the number of the aperture is big, it means that the hole size is small. For example, an f2.8 is a representation for a big hole, and an aperture of f16 is a representation of a small hole. So they are opposite to each other. Big numbers, small holes. Small numbers, big holes. So let us now do some aperture trials. I'm also using the EOS 100D camera. On the EOS 100D, you can see on the back screen the settings that we have. The aperture is here, the f number, currently it's f8, and here is the shutter speed. To change the aperture on the EOS 100D, you click on the AV button and you hold, and then you rotate the dial. So we will start at f8. In these shots, we are fixing the shutter speed. We are not changing it. This does not mean that in real life we are going to fix the shutter speed every time we are going to change the aperture. But just to understand the aperture more, since it's the first trial to us, we will fix the shutter, and later on through these tutorials we will see how can we change both of them, and we see how can they affect our images. So in these shots, the shutter speed will be fixed and only the aperture will change. Well, we are going to start at f8. If I take a reading, I see currently that the meter shows that I am normal exposed. So let's take a shot. We see from this image that the colors are good, everything is right, and the picture is normally exposed. Let us now decrease the f value. Remember, when we decrease the f number, we will increase the size of the opening of the camera, which means more light will be entering, therefore the image will be overexposed. So on the 100D, I have to click on the AV button and hold it and change the dial. So let's try. So let's go to f5.6. If I take a reading, the camera shows me that I'm one stop overexposing. Let's take a shot. So it's clear from this shot that we are overexposed and more light entered into the camera. This is because we opened the opening of the camera more. Let's decrease the f value more, which means increasing the opening more and allowing more light to enter. So if I click and hold on AV, so the maximum this lens that can reach is 3.5. So this is the maximum opening value for the lens. So let's try to take a reading. Also, the meter shows that we are 2 stops over exposing our picture. So let's take it. Yeah, it's obviously and clear that this picture is more overexposed than the 2 previous ones and more light entered into the camera. Now let's do the opposite. Let's go to underexposing the picture. If you remember, we started at f8, so I will go to f16. So click and hold AV button and rotate the dial. So here at f16, if I take a reading, we see that we are 2 stops underexposing the picture. So let's take the shot. Yeah, you can see that everything is darker and it's clear that the picture is underexposed. This is because at f16 we are closing the opening of the camera more and less light is entering inside the camera. Let's now go to the maximum value that this lens allows us to close the opening size. Well, on this lens it is f22, so this is the maximum value that we can close or decrease the size of the opening of the camera. So let's take a reading. We are at least 3 stops underexposed. Let's take this shot. And we can see from the result that the picture is really underexposed. So like in shutter speed, by changing the aperture value, we are changing the amount of light entering into the camera, and this will affect the overall image by being either overexposed, underexposed, or normally exposed. Let us go back to the idea of fixing the shutter speed while changing the aperture values. To explain more what's happening in this idea, let's take the theoretical example. We are going to demonstrate the idea of aperture and a camera by water sources. So, when the aperture value is small, in other words, when the opening of the camera is big, we will demonstrate that by a big water source. And when the aperture of the camera is big, like f16, this means that the opening in the camera is small, and we are going to demonstrate it by a small water source. And we are going to demonstrate the shutter speed by an interval of time in which we are going to open these 2 water sources. So the idea is we are going to open these 2 water sources for the same time. And we are going to see which water source will fill the cups in more water. So the fixed time is the shutter speed. It is the time for the image to be taken. And the water is the light entering into the camera, and the size of the source is the aperture value. So let's try. Let's open these 2 water sources for a fixed amount of time. And needless to say, the bigger water source will fill the cup with more water using the same time interval. Why is that? Yes, although the time is fixed for the 2 water sources, which means the shutter speed is fixed, but since the bigger water source has a bigger size, it can allow more quantity of water to pass in one interval of time. And this is the same idea in photography. When the aperture value is small, meaning that the opening is big, so per 1 unit of time, more light can enter. And when the aperture value is big, meaning that the opening of the camera is small, it means small amount of light can enter in 1 unit of time. This is why if you have a fixed shutter speed, a fixed duration in which light is entering into your camera, the case where the aperture has a bigger opening will allow more light to enter. So what is it about the aperture? Is it only the idea of allowing more light or less light to enter? This is the same thing as shutter speed. So why to use aperture? We can only stick to shutter speed and no need for the aperture in that case. Well, sure not. The aperture has another very important thing, which is called the depth of field. So let's talk in the next section about the depth of field.